Welcome back to my channel, friends! Tonight we go way back in time to 1692. We are going back to the Salem Witch Trials. So get comfortable and turn the lights off and relax, and let's journey back in time. If you enjoy watching this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel, but only if you really enjoy it. In the frosty edges of Massachusetts Bay Colony, where fields froze before the harvest could be finished, and the church bell ruled the rhythm of the day, Salem Village sat quietly most of the time. The year was 1692, and quiet was a relative term here. Life was simple, but it wasn't easy. People rose before dawn, worked until their bones groaned, and still found time to fret over who was and wasn't in God's favour. On the best days, it smelled faintly of baking bread. On the worst, it reeked of wet wool, unwashed hands, and the faint, lingering dread of winter. This was a place where faith was the air you breathed, and suspicion, well, that was the water you drank. Salem Village was not Boston. It wasn't even Salem Town, the busier port just a few miles away. This was farmland and forest, a smattering of homes, and more silence than most people today could stand. Neighbours lived far enough apart to give you privacy, but close enough to hear the rumour mill turning. It was a place where the forest wasn't just the outdoors, it was dark, mysterious, and, if you listened to the right sermons, full of devils waiting behind every pine tree. That kind of thinking made for an odd mix of community warmth and constant paranoia. People here trusted each other, until they didn't. At the heart of the village stood the meeting house, where politics, religion, and gossip all blended together in one long wooden echo chamber. Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister, wasn't exactly the life of the party, unless your idea of a party was a stern 2-hour sermon about eternal damnation. He was a man who liked rules, especially when he was the one making them. He was also the kind of man who saw the devil's handiwork in everything, from failed crops to someone showing up late to service. In January 1692, the Parris household started to notice something odd. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began having strange fits. They screamed, threw things, twisted into odd positions, and spoke words no one claimed to understand. This wasn't your everyday childhood tantrum. The local doctor couldn't explain it, except to say that maybe, just maybe, witchcraft was involved. That suggestion was like tossing a match into a barn full of dry hay. It didn't help that Salem was already a powder keg. People argued over land boundaries, church leadership, and whether the village should have its own minister or stay tied to Salem Town. On top of that, there had been recent wars with the French and their Native American allies, leaving the area scarred and fearful. Many of the villagers had fled from the war zones, bringing stories of massacre and destruction. Fear was already in the air. Betty and Abigail's strange behaviour just gave it a focus. The Reverend's kitchen maid, Tituba, was about as far from the typical Salem resident as you could get. She was an enslaved woman of Caribbean origin, and her presence alone stirred curiosity. Some whispered she told stories of spirits and magic to the children. Others swore she dabbled in strange remedies from her homeland. Whether or not any of it was true didn't matter much. Her difference made her a perfect target. By midwinter, more girls began showing symptoms: Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard. The list was growing. They claimed to see strange apparitions, animals that spoke, and shadows lurking at the edge of their vision. Their stories were eerily similar, and each retelling made the details more vivid. People began to avoid walking alone at night. Doors were barred. The meeting house sermons got louder. The devil, it seemed, was making himself comfortable in Salem Village. The problem with fear is that it needs a villain, and in Salem villains weren't hard to find, especially if you were poor, outspoken, or simply different. Before long, the afflicted girls started naming names. Sarah Good, a destitute beggar. Sarah Osborne, a woman who skipped church and married her servant. And Tituba, who was already whispered about. The accused were suddenly the talk of the village, their every word and movement scrutinised. Still, in January, most villagers hoped this would pass, just another strange winter story. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Salem's long-standing disputes, grudges, and resentments were bubbling up, looking for an excuse to spill over. And now, thanks to Betty and Abigail's fits, they had one. People began to wonder who might be next on the list of the accused. Even the most pious souls started to glance over their shoulders. Looking back now, you can almost feel the shift in the air. A mix of fear and curiosity, like the moment before a storm breaks. Salem Village was still quiet in January 1692, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath it, rumours were spreading faster than the winter frost. It wouldn't be long before whispers turned into accusations, and accusations turned into nooses. But for now, Salem held its breath. By the time February 1692 crept in, Salem village was buried under snow and rumour. The cold seemed to sink into people's bones, the kind of winter that made joints ache and tempers short. In the Parris household, however, the chill was nothing compared to the strangeness unfolding upstairs. 9-year-old Betty Parris had become the centre of attention, not because she was charming or clever, but because she was changing. She would sit in the corner of the room and stare at nothing, her little hands trembling. Sometimes she screamed at invisible shapes only she could see. And then there was Abigail Williams, her 11-year-old cousin, who followed suit as if fear were contagious. It wasn't as though sickness was rare in Salem. Fevers came and went, and the colony's medical knowledge was limited to herbs, prayers, and whatever the neighbours swore had cured their cousin last year. But what was happening to Betty and Abigail didn't look like illness. It looked like possession. At least that's what some of the villagers whispered. They claimed to have seen the girls contort their bodies in unnatural ways, to speak in voices that didn't sound like their own. Sometimes they darted under furniture, as if hiding from an unseen hand. This wasn't the kind of thing a poultice or a warm broth could fix. Dr. William Griggs, the local physician, was summoned to examine the girls. He was a man with more patience than tools, and after poking, prodding and questioning, he declared there was no natural explanation for their behaviour. In Puritan New England, no natural explanation had an all-too-obvious implication: the supernatural, witchcraft. With that single word, the doctor may as well have handed the devil his invitation to Salem. Once the idea of witchcraft took hold, it spread like smoke through the village. People didn't ask, could this be witchcraft? They asked, who is doing this to them? Puritan belief was simple on this matter. The devil could not act alone. He needed human agents, witches, who signed his book and did his bidding. And if witches were among them, every man, woman and child was in danger. It was no longer about curing the girls. It was about protecting the entire community from the unseen enemy in their midst. The afflicted girls began to talk about what they were seeing. They described black dogs with eyes like burning coals, spectral women pinching them, and shadowy figures standing at the foot of their beds. They claimed they were being choked, pricked and stabbed, yet no mark showed on their skin. Every new vision was more terrifying than the last, and the adults, instead of dismissing them, leaned in to listen. Salem was a place where dreams and reality blurred easily when the devil was involved. It wasn't long before other young women in the village began showing the same symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis and Elizabeth Hubbard joined the ranks of the afflicted. They twitched, convulsed and shrieked in unison, sometimes collapsing to the floor as though struck down by invisible forces. The spectacle was both horrifying and mesmerising. People couldn't look away. And just like that, the number of victims grew, giving weight to the belief that a coven of witches was at work. In Puritan society, children were expected to be quiet, obedient, and nearly invisible during adult affairs. Now, these same children had become the most listened to voices in the village. Their words were treated as truth, their visions as evidence. It was a strange reversal of order, one that fed the drama. Every time a girl gasped or shrieked in church, all eyes turned to see who or what might have provoked it. And if a suspected person happened to be in the room, well, that was all the proof some people needed. Reverend Parris took the matter personally. To him, the devil attacking his household was not just a spiritual crisis, it was a direct challenge to his authority. He began to preach fiery sermons about the dangers of sin and the reality of Satan's presence in Salem. Each Sunday, his words stoked the villagers' fear until it simmered like a pot on the hearth, ready to boil over. Meanwhile, the afflicted girls were under pressure to name their tormentors. At first, they hesitated. After all, accusing the wrong person could ruin lives. But in Salem, hesitation was dangerous too. What if their silence had allowed the devil to grow stronger? And so names began to form on their lips. Sarah Good, the village beggar, Sarah Osborne, who rarely attended church, and Tituba, the Parris household servant, whose difference made her an easy target. The stage was set for something Salem would never forget. Looking back, it's tempting to see these early days as inevitable, like a snowball rolling downhill. But in February 1692, the people of Salem still thought they could stop it. They didn't know that by naming names they were opening the floodgates. The first afflictions were only the beginning. Soon the village would be swept into a storm of trials, executions, and regret so deep it would echo for centuries. By late February 1692, the mood in Salem village had shifted from uneasy curiosity to active dread. Betty Parris and Abigail Williams were no longer the only ones suffering fits. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and Elizabeth Hubbard had joined the chorus of shrieks, gasps, and contortions. Some claimed the girls were bewitched. Others, more practical, wondered if it was a sickness of the body. But in Puritan New England, the line between the medical and the spiritual was as thin as frost on a window pane, and just as easy to shatter. When Dr. William Griggs admitted he could find no natural cause for the afflictions, his words carried the weight of a gavel striking wood. In Salem, that verdict left only one possibility: the supernatural. And if the devil was at work, it meant human hands had invited him in. People began to speculate, quietly at first, about who might have given him that welcome. Maybe it was the old widow who muttered to herself in the fields. Maybe it was the beggar woman with the sharp tongue. Maybe it was the strange servant from faraway lands. The human mind doesn't like a mystery without a villain. The afflicted girls told their own version of the mystery. They said they were being pinched and pricked by invisible hands. They claimed to see creatures, a black dog here, a yellow bird there, that no one else could. They described a tall man in dark clothes who whispered to them in their dreams, offering them things they dared not repeat aloud. Each tale added a layer of horror, and the listeners leaned in, equal parts appalled and enthralled. In a place where Sunday sermons painted hell in vivid detail, these stories didn't seem so far-fetched. To the Puritan mind, the devil was not a metaphor. He was a living, thinking being who prowled the earth, seeking to corrupt and destroy. He was not just in far-off lands or the deep forest. He could be in your neighbour's kitchen, your own barn, or even the meeting house pew beside you. The girl's symptoms were seen as proof that he was already in Salem, and if he was here, someone had invited him. That was the dangerous logic. If evil was close, then someone close must be evil. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some thought the girls were simply bored, a dangerous condition in a place where recreation was considered sinful, and winter days were long and empty. Others quietly suspected the girls enjoyed the sudden attention. After all, in a society where children were supposed to be silent and unseen, being at the centre of every conversation must have felt like a strange sort of power. But even those who doubted dared not speak too loudly. In Salem, to question the hunt for witches was to risk being labelled one yourself. There were practical explanations too, though no one wanted to hear them. The girls might have been suffering from some illness, perhaps food poisoning, epilepsy, or even an allergic reaction to mouldy rye. But mouldy rye didn't make for compelling fireside talk the way the devil's work did. In a community primed by years of sermons about witchcraft and damnation, the supernatural explanation wasn't just more exciting, it felt more righteous. As the speculation deepened, Salem's long-standing divisions began to colour the conversation. The village was already split between those who supported Reverend Parris and those who thought he was a tyrant. Land disputes, inheritance quarrels, and old grudges all bubbled beneath the surface. It was easy to see the devil's hand in the life of someone you already disliked. And so, when the afflicted girls cried out in pain during church, more than a few heads turned toward old rivals. The forest surrounding Salem didn't help matters. For the Puritans, it was a place of both physical and spiritual danger, home to wild animals, hostile forces, and, in their minds, the devil himself. The afflicted girls sometimes claimed they saw strange figures disappearing into the trees at night. Whether these visions were born of fevered imaginations or something more, they fit perfectly into the villagers' fears. The forest was the perfect hiding place for evil. By now, the question was no longer, what is happening to the girls, but who is doing this to them? Reverend Parris began organising prayer meetings to combat the devil's influence, and the afflicted were encouraged to speak openly about their visions. Every new description added fuel to the fire, and when those visions started including recognisable faces, the fire began to spread into something no one could easily put out. Looking back, it's easy to see that Salem wasn't just searching for a cause, it was searching for someone to blame. The cold, the hunger, the political disputes, the losses from war, all of it needed a reason. And if the devil was already suspected, then finding his agents became a sacred duty. Before long, suspicion would harden into accusation, and accusation into something far more deadly. But for now, Salem was still in the asking stage. even if the questions were already dripping with answers. By the end of February 1692, Salem village had moved past the stage of wondering if witchcraft was at work. Now, they were asking the more dangerous question: who was behind it? It wasn't a matter of maybe anymore. The devil was here, everyone agreed on that, and someone had opened the door for him. To the afflicted girls, the pressure to name names was like a weight pressing on their chests, and finally they exhaled. The first name was Sarah Good. Poor, homeless and sharp-tongued, she had been a fixture of Salem's streets for years. She begged for food and shelter, muttering curses when she was turned away, which was often. She owned no land, had no friends in high places, and no way to defend herself if someone decided to call her a witch. For the people of Salem, she fit the picture perfectly: poor, bitter, and inconvenient. The second name was Sarah Osborne. Unlike Good, Osborne wasn't destitute, but she had made choices that earned her the community's disapproval. She had stopped attending church regularly, which was already suspicious enough, and she had scandalised the village by marrying her servant. In Salem's rigid social order, that was the kind of decision that stuck in people's throats. It wasn't just that she might be a witch, it was that she didn't live by the rules. The third name was the most controversial: Tituba, the enslaved woman in the Parris household. She was different in almost every way from the rest of Salem. Her skin was darker, her speech carried a different rhythm, and her life before Massachusetts was a mystery to most. Rumours swirled that she knew strange folk remedies or told stories of spirits. In a community primed to see the unfamiliar as dangerous, she was the perfect target. When the girls named these three women, the reaction was immediate. To accuse someone of witchcraft wasn't just to insult them, it was to declare them an enemy of God. The accused could be arrested, put on trial, and, if found guilty, executed. Yet in Salem's logic, not naming them would have been worse. If the witches went unpunished, the devil would grow stronger. The community had been given villains, and now it was ready for a reckoning. On March 3rd, 1602, the first formal examinations of the accused took place at the meeting house in Salem village. Villagers crowded in to watch, their breath visible in the cold air. The girls performed their afflictions on cue, shrieking, twisting, and pointing at the accused as if invisible hands were attacking them. The audience gasped and murmured with each display. It was theatre, religion, and law rolled into one grim performance. Sarah Good denied any involvement with witchcraft. She insisted she was innocent, but every sharp word, every quarrel she'd ever had with a neighbour, was dragged out and examined like evidence. Sarah Osborne, sick and frail, could barely defend herself. She denied the charges too, but in a place where absence from church was considered suspicious, her protests carried little weight. Tituba, however, told a different story. Whether from fear, coercion, or a calculated bid for survival, she confessed. She claimed that she had seen the devil, and that he had appeared in the form of a man from Boston. She spoke of black dogs, red cats, and yellow birds, and of a book in which witches signed their names in blood. She even said there were other witches working with her, more than she could count. Every word landed like a hammer blow on the villagers' nerves. Her confession was a turning point. Instead of calming the hysteria, it fed it. The idea that there were many witches in Salem, hiding in plain sight, sent shivers through the room. If witches could be poor beggars, respected wives, and even servants in the minister's home, then no one was safe. Tituba's story became the spark that turned a fearful village into a hunting party. By the time the examinations ended, Salem had crossed a line it could never uncross. The first accusations had been made, the first confessions extracted, and the idea of a hidden army of witches had taken root. People left the meeting house with the sense that a great evil had been uncovered, and that it was now their sacred duty to destroy it. What they didn't realise was that in their rush to purge the devil, they had opened the door to something just as dangerous, themselves. March 3rd, 1692, had already been long and cold by the time Tituba stood before the magistrates. She was no stranger to the Reverend Parris's strict household, nor to the whispers about her in Salem village. But now, every pair of eyes in the meeting house was on her. The room was packed, villagers standing shoulder to shoulder, breath clouding in the icy air, waiting to hear if this woman, the minister's own servant, would admit to inviting the devil into their midst. She could have denied everything. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne had done just that, clinging to their innocence, even as the afflicted girls shrieked and writhed at the sight of them. But Tituba had been watching. She had seen the way the crowd leaned forward at every dramatic fit. She had seen the magistrates' faces harden when someone claimed innocence. She must have understood deep down that the truth wouldn't save her, but a story might. When she opened her mouth, what came out was not a denial, but a flood. She said yes, she had seen the devil, since she had been visited by strange creatures, a black dog with blazing eyes, a red cat that whispered, and a yellow bird that perched on a witch's shoulder. She spoke of a tall man in dark clothing who asked her to sign his book. Her words painted pictures so vivid that the room seemed to shrink around them. The villagers were riveted. Here at last was someone who could explain the chaos. Tituba didn't stop at describing the creatures. She told them there were others, more witches in Salem, more than she could count. She claimed they met at night, plotting the village's destruction. She said they rode on sticks through the air, danced under the moon, and drank blood as part of their rituals. It was everything the Puritans feared, delivered in perfect, horrifying detail. Her confession didn't just confirm that witchcraft was real, it expanded the threat. If there were many witches, they could be anywhere. A neighbour, a friend, even a family member. The villagers began glancing around the room at one another, wondering who was hiding the devil's mark under their collar. Fear spread like a draught through the meeting house, chilling even those closest to the fire. Why did Tituba confess? Historians still debate it. Some say she was trying to save herself, that confessing was safer than denying. Others believe she was coerced, pressured by Parris or the magistrates into giving them exactly what they wanted to hear. And there's the possibility that Tituba, an enslaved woman with little power, saw in this moment a rare chance to turn the tables, to command the room, if only for a little while. Whatever her reasons, her words changed the course of the trials. A simple accusation was one thing, but a confession, detailed, colourful and frightening, was a gift to the magistrates. It gave them the proof they needed to continue. It also gave the afflicted girls new material for their fits. When Tituba spoke of the witches' Sabbaths, the girls clutched their throats. When she described the devil's book, they claimed they saw it floating in the air. Every word became fuel. Tituba's testimony also shifted the rules. Before, a person might hope to avoid suspicion by living quietly and attending church. Now, with the claim that witches were everywhere, no amount of piety could guarantee safety. A minister could be a witch, a farmer could be a witch, a child could be a witch. The boundaries between the godly and the damned had dissolved into mist. By the time Tituba finished speaking, the magistrates had exactly what they wanted. A confession that proved the devil was at work and hinted that the conspiracy was bigger than anyone feared. They didn't release her, of course. Confessing to witchcraft was still a crime. But she had bought herself time. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, who had denied everything, were in far more immediate danger. The unspoken lesson was clear. Confession was a kind of shield, even if it was a cracked one. When the crowd spilled out into the cold night air, the village felt different. The devil was no longer a shadow lurking in the woods. He was in the village, hiding behind familiar faces, and if Tituba's words were true, there were still names to be spoken, still witches to be found. The hunt, once a creeping thing, was now running full tilt. Salem's long winter had just grown darker. By early June 1692, the accusations had multiplied faster than the snowdrifts in February. Dozens were now in jail, some for weeks, waiting for trials that never seemed to come. The small holding cells in Salem and nearby towns were overflowing, the air inside thick with the smells of damp wood, unwashed clothes, and fear. Governor William Phips, newly returned from England, decided something had to be done. His solution was to create a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which in French means to hear and determine. It sounded official, and more importantly, it sounded final. The court was made up of some of the most powerful men in the colony. William Staunton as Chief Justice, Samuel Sewell, John Hathorne, and others. These were not men inclined toward mercy. They saw themselves as defenders of the faith, tasked with rooting out the devil's agents. The problem, of course, was that once you believed the devil was real and active in your neighbourhood, almost anything could be evidence. The rules of this court were flexible. In England, witchcraft trials had been going out of style, and spectral evidence, visions and dreams, was generally frowned upon. But in Salem, spectral evidence was welcome like an old friend. If the afflicted girls said they saw your spirit tormenting them in their dreams, that was enough to put you on trial. If they claimed they saw you in the shape of a bird or a dog, or a shadow that could be used against you. No physical proof was required, just fear and a good imagination. The first case before the court was Bridget Bishop. She was an easy target, outspoken, fond of wearing bright clothes, and known to argue with her neighbours. She ran an inn and played shuffleboard, which some considered sinful. Most damning of all, she had already been accused of witchcraft years earlier, though she had been acquitted. This time, with the court's new rules, she wouldn't be so lucky. The trial unfolded like a piece of theatre. The afflicted girls gasped and collapsed whenever Bishop looked at them. Witnesses claimed her spectre had appeared in their homes at night. One man swore that a black cat had sat on his chest until he could barely breathe, and that the cat had Bridget Bishop's face. It was a bizarre mix of the ridiculous and the deadly serious, and every gasp from the girls seemed to seal Bishop's fate. When the verdict came, guilty, it was no surprise. Bridget Bishop was sentenced to hang. On June the 10th, 1692, she was taken to Gallows Hill. She maintained her innocence to the end, but in Salem that summer, innocence was no shield. The execution was public, a grim reminder to all who might consider crossing the court, and just like that, the court of Oyer and Terminer had claimed its first life. The court's work didn't slow after Bishop's death, it accelerated. With each trial, the process became more streamlined. The afflicted girls grew bolder, their performances more elaborate. The judges seemed more certain of their mission, and the townspeople, seeing the machinery of justice turning, began to believe the trials were uncovering something real. Every execution felt like progress in the fight against an invisible enemy. The court of Oyer and Terminer didn't just operate in Salem village, it reached into surrounding towns. Accusations spilled across borders, and soon, people in Ipswich, Andover and beyond found themselves called to answer for alleged crimes committed in the shape of an animal or in someone's dreams. The net was wide, and the court had no problem hauling in anyone it pleased. The court's reliance on spectral evidence drew criticism from some corners, but those voices were drowned out by the roar of fear. Increase Mather, a respected minister, would later argue that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. But in the summer of 1692, that was a minority opinion. The prevailing mood was summed up by Chief Justice Staunton's own approach. Better to condemn on suspicion than to risk letting a witch go free. By the end of its first month, the court of Oyer and Terminer had made itself indispensable and deadly. It was the perfect stage for Salem's fears, dramatic, authoritative and unyielding. The judges believed they were fighting for the soul of the colony. The villagers believed they were watching God's justice in action. No one seemed to realise that the court was also writing a script that would end in regret, and that its final act would stain Salem's name for centuries. June 10, 1692, dawned grey and heavy. The sun rose behind a blanket of low clouds, spilling only a pale, cold light over Salem. From the meeting house to the wharves, whispers moved faster than the tide. Bridget Bishop was to hang. She would be the first to be found guilty by the court of Oyer and Terminer, the first to feel the rope in this season of accusations. And for those who believed in her guilt, she was the first step toward cleansing Salem of the devil's taint. Bridget Bishop had spent her life standing out in ways that Salem did not forgive. She wore bright red bodices instead of dull brown, played shuffleboard, and ran an inn where men and women mingled more freely than the Puritans liked. She had been accused of witchcraft before, years earlier, and acquitted, but that only made her a more tempting target now. For her enemies, this wasn't just about witchcraft. It was about settling old scores. From the jail, she was led through the village. Armed guards flanked her, muskets at the ready, while villagers trailed behind, some silent, others muttering prayers or curses. The road wound uphill toward a barren rise just outside town, Gallows Hill. It was a place of rocky soil and sparse grass, the kind of ground where nothing grew easily. The hill had no gallows before this day, but by the time the sun set it would have its grim wooden frame. Gallows Hill was chosen for its visibility. From here the town could see justice, or what passed for it, carried out. In Puritan belief, a public execution was more than punishment. It was a warning, a sermon without words. And so the villagers gathered. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Men stood with arms crossed, faces hard. The wind carried the smell of the sea up the hill, mixing with the damp scent of turned earth. The execution itself was quick in the physical sense, but long in the mind. Bishop was made to stand before the crowd. The minister prayed loudly for her soul, though whether for her benefit or the crowd's was unclear. She maintained her innocence, her voice carrying over the murmurs. Then the noose was placed, the trap released, and silence fell except for the creak of rope. In Salem's eyes, the devil had lost one of his agents that day, but death was only part of the purpose. The real work of the gallows was in the minds of those who watched. The villagers left the hill with the image of Bishop's final moments burned into them. For some, it confirmed that the trials were just. For others, it sparked the first quiet doubts. If she had been a witch, why did she not confess at the end? Why pray to God if she had served the devil? Those thoughts were dangerous in Salem, and so they were kept hidden. The court of Oyer and Terminer saw Bishop's execution as a success. It proved the system worked. Accusations could be heard, guilt determined, punishment delivered. It also proved something else, that the court had the will to follow through. From now on, anyone accused would have Bishop's fate in the back of their mind. Confess and name others, and you might live. Deny, and you might hang. Back in the village, the gossip swelled. Some claimed they had seen a blackbird fly away from the gallows at the moment Bishop died. Others swore they felt a sudden chill, as though an unseen presence had left the hilltop. These stories, whether born of imagination or fear, spread quickly. In Salem, strange details had a way of becoming proof. In the days that followed, the executions became easier to imagine. The people of Salem had seen the rope, heard the crack, watched the stillness that followed. The abstract idea of punishing witches had become something they could picture clearly, and that made the machinery of accusation spin faster. If it could happen to Bridget Bishop, it could happen to anyone. Years later, when the trials were over and regret had replaced zeal, Gallows Hill would become a place of uneasy silence. Grass would grow where the crowd once stood. The gallows would be gone. But in June 1692, it was a stage, and Salem had just witnessed its first act of a deadly play, one that was far from over. After Bridget Bishop's execution, Salem village didn't calm down. It vibrated. The news travelled quickly, carried by gossip and the steady shuffle of travellers along the dirt roads. In a colony where most days were predictable and slow, this was a story everyone wanted to hear. And unlike a storm or a poor harvest, this wasn't just something that happened to you. This was something you could do something about. You could point, you could name, you could accuse. In Salem, fear had a way of spilling over its borders. By mid-June, accusations were leaping from one town to another, from Salem village to Salem town to Ipswich, Andover and beyond. If someone in your family was accused, you might find yourself accused next, simply because guilt was thought to run in blood. If you defended an accused person, people wondered why. And if you stayed silent, well, maybe you had something to hide. The afflicted girls were the most portable weapons Salem had ever seen. They could be brought into any meeting house, pointer to stranger, and collapse into a screaming fit. In a culture where spiritual warfare was taken as fact, this was as persuasive as fingerprints in a modern courtroom. Ministers and magistrates started summoning the girls to neighbouring towns, where they put on the same grim performances that had swayed Salem's court. In Andover, the panic took on a life of its own. There, entire families were accused in a single day. Husbands, wives, and even children were hauled in for questioning. Some confessed quickly, thinking that admission would save their necks. Others denied everything, and found that denials carried no more weight in Andover than they had in Salem. By the summer's height, Andover had more accused witches than any other town in the colony. The speed of the hysteria was helped along by old grudges. If you had argued over a property line, competed for the same land, or married the person someone else wanted, the trials offered a convenient chance for revenge. All you had to do was suggest that your rival had appeared to you in spectral form, pinching and tormenting you in your bed. That was enough to have them hauled in. Salem's accusations had started as a few names, but now they were turning into a list long enough to fill the court's days for months. The jails, already crowded, began to groan under the weight of the accused. People were shipped off to Boston, Ipswich, and other towns simply because there wasn't enough space in Salem's cells. For the prisoners, this meant weeks or months of waiting, sometimes in chains, always in cold and filth, before they even saw the inside of a courtroom. Families were left scrambling to care for children, work the fields, and keep homes running with one or more members locked away. The more people were accused, the easier it became to accuse more. confessors were pressured to name others to prove their own repentance. One person's confession could yield half a dozen new names, each of those leading to more. It was a chain reaction, each link forged out of fear. The court of Oyer and Terminer encouraged it, believing they were peeling away layers of a vast and secret conspiracy. This expansion of the trials changed the mood in the entire colony. Where once witchcraft had been a rumour, it was now treated as an infestation. The sermons became darker. Ministers preached about the hidden devil that could be living in the godliest-looking neighbour. Ordinary disputes, a cow wandering onto the wrong pasture, a debt unpaid, took on new and dangerous meanings. By August, the fear had settled into something like routine. Arrests were normal, trials were scheduled, the gallows were ready, the executions were public, and each time another body swung, the crowd left with the uneasy satisfaction that one more threat had been removed. Few paused to wonder how many of those threats were real. The hysteria didn't just spread in space, it spread in minds, until it became the air everyone breathed. Looking back, the summer of 1692 reads like a wildfire map. Sparks leaping from town to town, fueled by wind and dry tinder. And just like a fire, the hysteria consumed everything it touched. Reputations, relationships, livelihoods, and lives. Salem had lit the match, but by August the blaze belonged to all of Massachusetts, and no one seemed ready to put it out. By July 1692, the Salem gallows had already claimed Bridget Bishop. But the summer heat did nothing to slow the machinery of the court of Oyer and Terminer. If anything, it made tempers shorter and fear quicker to spark. The list of the accused had grown longer than anyone could have imagined back in February. Now, some of the colony's most respected names were on it, people whose piety and community service had once been beyond question. One of those names was Rebecca Nurse. 71 years old, frail and deeply religious, she was the kind of person people once went to for comfort. But she had land, and land disputes in Salem were as common as frost in winter. The Putnam family, one of the most vocal in the witchcraft accusations, had a history of quarrels with the Nurse family over property lines. When the afflicted girls accused her, it shocked many, but shock didn't stop the warrant from being signed. Her trial drew a crowd. At first, the evidence against her seemed flimsy. Spectral attacks, strange fits in her presence. But the girls put on a performance that was hard to ignore. They gasped, shrieked, and collapsed when Rebecca looked their way. Witnesses told stories of seeing her spectre tormenting children. Even her good reputation couldn't shield her. In July, she was found guilty and sentenced to hang. George Burroughs was another name that surprised many. He had once been the minister of Salem Village, though his time there had ended in disputes over salary and supplies. Now living in Maine, he was dragged back under accusations that he was the leader of the witches. The girls claimed he could perform impossible feats of strength, and that his spectre had appeared to them in dark rituals. His arrest sent the message that no rank, not even that of a minister, was beyond suspicion. Burroughs's execution in August became one of the most infamous moments of the trials. Just before the noose was placed, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something believed impossible for a witch. For a moment the crowd hesitated. If he could pray so flawlessly, could he really serve the devil? But Chief Justice Staunton dismissed it as a trick, and the execution went on. The rope tightened, and the doubts were swallowed in silence. Martha Carrier was another August casualty. Cotton Mather himself called her the Queen of Hell. She had a sharp tongue and a defiant manner, which in Salem's climate was almost as dangerous as owning a broomstick. She laughed at her accusers in court, refusing to confess or plead for mercy. Her defiance only sealed her fate. She was hanged on August 19th alongside Burroughs and others, still proclaiming her innocence. By September, the gallows had claimed 19 lives in total. Men and women, young and old, rich and poor, there no pattern beyond the fact that someone, somewhere, had accused them. The trials had developed a rhythm: accusation, examination, trial, execution. The names changed, the details shifted, but the outcome rarely did. For the court, this was proof that they were succeeding. For the accused, it was proof that there was no way out. The pace of executions left the colony uneasy. Every hanging brought whispers of doubt. Some people began to wonder why so many accused witches went to the gallows without confessing. If they truly served the devil, wouldn't they try to save themselves with a false repentance? But these doubts were dangerous. Speaking them aloud risked making you the next target. And so they stayed locked behind tight lips. Even those who had once cheered the trials began to feel the weight of loss. Fields went untended, businesses suffered, families were fractured, their homes empty. The constant arrests meant fewer hands for planting, harvesting, or mending. And the fear, that constant, humming fear, was exhausting. It crept into dreams, turned neighbours into strangers, and made every knock at the door sound like the start of an accusation. The summer of 1692 would end with more bodies in the earth, and more names on the court's docket. The gallows had become a fixture, as much a part of Salem's landscape as the meeting house steeple. But while the court saw its work as righteous, the seeds of doubt were beginning to take root, and in time those seeds would grow into something strong enough to stop the hangings. But in September the rope was still busy, and the air still smelled faintly of dust, sweat, and fear. By September 1692, Salem had grown used to the rhythm of the trials. Names were accused, the afflicted girls performed, the judges delivered their verdicts, and the gallows did the rest. But for the first time since the frenzy began, cracks began to show in the smooth, terrible machinery. These cracks didn't come from the accused, they came from those who had once stood firmly on the side of the court. It started quietly. A few ministers began to murmur that spectral evidence. The visions and dreams of the afflicted girls might not be the most reliable foundation for a death sentence. Increase Mather, one of the most respected ministers in Massachusetts, put it plainly. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. In Salem's charged air, that was a radical statement. The doubts weren't just theological, they were personal. The list of the accused was starting to include people from the colony's most respected families. Rebecca Nurse's execution had shaken many. George Burroughs's flawless recitation of the Lord's Prayer on the gallows had unsettled even more. If such godly-seeming people could be witches, then perhaps anyone could be. And if anyone could be, perhaps the court was not as infallible as it seemed. The turning point for many came in early September with the case of Giles Corey. The 81-year-old farmer refused to enter a plea when accused of witchcraft. Without a plea, the court could not try him, and so they used an old punishment called peine forte et dure, pressing the accused under heavy stones until they either entered a plea or died. Corey never pled. After 2 days of torture, he died, reportedly saying only, "More weight." His death horrified many and sparked whispers that the court's hunger for confessions had gone too far. Governor William Phips, who had created the Court of Oyer and Terminer only months earlier, was now facing political pressure from Boston's merchant class and influential ministers. The trials, once a proud demonstration of the colony's moral vigilance, were starting to look like a liability. Phips himself had a personal reason to rethink things. His own wife had been named in an accusation. Even the afflicted girls, whose fits and visions had fueled the trials, were beginning to lose some of their power. Their performances were still convincing to some, but others noticed they had become elaborate. Too elaborate. Accusations had leapt from poor beggars to wealthy merchants, ministers, and even a former governor's family. The randomness was harder to justify. In October, the number of new accusations slowed or minimum, not because the fear was gone, but because the fear had begun to shift. Now, it was the court itself that some people feared. What if the judges had condemned innocent souls? What if by following the afflicted girl's visions, they had been tricked by the devil into doing his work for him? In a culture that saw Satan's hand in every corner, this was a terrifying thought. The ministers' voices grew louder. Increase Mather, and others began openly urging the governor to restrict the court's use of spectral evidence. Without it, most of the cases would crumble. The logic was simple. If the only proof of witchcraft was something only one person could see, it was impossible to test or confirm. And if it could not be confirmed, it should not hang a person. Governor Phips, sensing the wind changing, finally acted. In late October, he suspended the Court of Oyer and Terminer. It was not the end of the trials, but it was the first real halt in their momentum since they began. For the prisoners awaiting judgment, it was a small breath of hope. For the judges and accusers, it was a sign that their authority might not be absolute after all. The cracks in the case had begun as whispers, but by the end of October they were visible to everyone. The executions had not stopped yet, but the unquestioned confidence of summer was gone. The idea that the court could be wrong, once unthinkable, was now part of the conversation. Salem had not yet admitted it, but the tide was turning. The devil was still in the sermons, But now, so was the possibility that the real danger had been in the courtroom all along. September 26, 1692, began like many days in that strange, terrible year, with a crowd gathering in Salem village, their faces set against the early autumn chill. The summer's heat had faded, replaced by the crisp bite of fall. But in the air that morning there was something else too, a heaviness. Everyone knew this would not be a single hanging. Today, 8 prisoners were scheduled to die on Gallows Hill, and even in a town that had grown used to death sentences, this felt final. Among those condemned was Martha Corey, wife of Giles Corey, the man who had been pressed to death only days earlier. She had been outspoken in her disbelief of the witchcraft accusations, and in Salem's feverish logic, disbelief itself was suspicious. The afflicted girls claimed her spectre tormented them, and when her husband was accused, her own guilt seemed sealed. She walked to the gallows with a calmness that unsettled those who had come to see justice served. Mary Easty, sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was also among the condemned. In her final petition to the court, she had pleaded not for her own life, but for an end to the shedding of innocent blood. "It is a sore thing," she wrote, "to see those that will be counted our best friends turn their hands against us." The court ignored her words, but they lingered in the minds of those who read them. The rest of the group included Anne Pudieta, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Wilmot Redd, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell. Some were outspoken, others had kept quiet until the end. But in Salem, silence was not safety. It was often taken as proof of guilt. Together, the 8 prisoners climbed the rocky slope of Gallows Hill, their steps slow and deliberate. By this time, the mood in Salem was not what it had been in June or July. Back then, each execution had felt like a victory against the devil. Now, there was an edge of discomfort. Too many respected people had been accused, too many last words had been calm professions of innocence. The minister's doubts about spectral evidence were becoming public knowledge, and Governor Phipps's suspension of the court of Oyer and Terminer was only weeks away. The certainty that had once powered the trials was slipping. Still, the executions went forward. The minister prayed, the nooses were tightened, and the trap was released. The sound was the same as it had been all summer, rope creaking, wood shifting, but to some in the crowd it no longer sounded like justice, it sounded like finality. And perhaps like a mistake. When the bodies were cut down, the crowd dispersed more quickly than usual. There were no triumphant whispers, no lingering groups retelling the afflicted girl's visions. People simply went home, shoulders hunched against the wind, their eyes on the ground. Even the girls themselves seemed quieter, as if the weight of their words was beginning to press on them. Those 8 deaths would be the last executions of the Salem Witch Trials. There were still accusations, still prisoners in the jails, but something in the town had shifted. The image of Giles Corey's slow, crushing death lingered. The thought of ministers' wives and respected elders in chains troubled people who had once been eager to condemn. The fire was burning low, and the fuel, the belief that every accusation was true, was running out. In the weeks that followed, Governor Phipps halted the use of spectral evidence and later dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer entirely. The cases that remained would be handled under stricter rules, and with those rules in place, convictions became rare. It was as if the whole colony had woken from a fever dream, only to find that the damage had already been done. For the families of the dead, the end of the hangings brought no comfort. They still carried the loss, and for years, decades, they would feel the sting of injustice. But for Salem itself, the last executions marked the point where the tide finally turned. The gallows stood empty, the rope unused, and in the chilly winds of late September, the town's appetite for death had finally gone cold. By late October 1692, Salem's gallows stood empty, but the jails were still full. Dozens of accused witches, men, women, even children, remained behind bars, their cases pending. But something in the air had shifted. Where once the court had been untouchable, now whispers of doubt crept through the colony. The question that no one had dared ask in June, could we have been wrong, was being asked quietly behind closed doors. Governor William Phipps, sensing that public opinion was turning, made a decisive move. He suspended the court of Oyer and Terminer. The court that had condemned 19 to the gallows and pressed one to death was no more. In its place, a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, would take over the remaining cases. But there was a catch. This court would no longer accept spectral evidence. Without the girls' visions and dreams as proof, the foundation of most cases crumbled instantly. For the accused still in jail, this change was life-altering. One by one, cases were dropped. Some were acquitted outright. Others were released simply because there was no longer enough evidence to justify holding them. It was as if the colony had woken from a fever dream and found itself surrounded by the wreckage, and was now trying clumsily to clean it up. But freedom was not the same as absolution. Those released carried the stain of accusation, and in a deeply religious society, that stain was hard to scrub away. Neighbours might greet them politely, but still glance sideways in the market. Former friends might cross the street rather than pass too close. Being acquitted didn't erase months of whispered suspicion. Meanwhile, the afflicted girls, once the darlings of the court, began to fade into the background. Without the authority of the court of Oyer and Terminer to amplify their voices, their visions carried less weight. Some quietly left Salem. Others stayed, slipping back into the roles they had held before the trials began. But their performances, so vivid in the summer, were no longer welcome on the public stage. The ministers who had supported the trials now faced their own reckoning. Increase Mathieu's warning about condemning the innocent became a rallying point for those who had opposed the trials from the start. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, would later stand in the meeting house and publicly confess his guilt in participating in the trials, but that was still months away. In the autumn of 1692, the clergy were more cautious with their words, careful not to be seen as having been wrong all along. Even with the court dissolved, the colony couldn't simply forget. The losses were too fresh, the questions too sharp. What had started with a handful of girls in the Reverend Parris's household had ended with more than 24 people dead and many more broken. The roads and meeting houses where accusations had once flown freely now felt quieter, not peaceful, but watchful. For some families, there was nothing left to return to. Land had been seized, homes sold off, livelihoods destroyed. Prisoners had to pay for their own food and chains while incarcerated, leaving many bankrupt upon release. Some were left with no choice but to move away entirely, seeking a fresh start in a place where their names were not stained by the trials. Reverend Samuel Parris faced mounting criticism too. His sermons, once fiery condemnations of witches, now rang hollow to many in the congregation. Some blamed him for fanning the flames in the first place. Within a few years, he would be forced to resign and leave Salem. The pulpit that had once been his fortress became a reminder of how quickly authority could turn to isolation. By the year's end, the frenzy had burned itself out. The trials had not ended with a dramatic declaration of innocence, but with a slow, awkward collapse, a kind of communal retreat from the edge. Salem was left with empty gallows, open jail cells, and a memory it would never quite shake. The devil had not been banished, and perhaps never would be, but the will to hunt him in the courts had at last run dry. When the last noose had swung and the last jail cell creaked open, Salem was left with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe, but presses heavy on the chest. It was winter now, and the snow covered Gallows Hill like a shroud. But beneath the white, the ground was still what it had been. The place where 20 innocent souls had died. The people of Salem had wanted the devil driven out. Instead, they were left with memories they could not bury. Families mourned in private. There were no grand funerals for witches. The bodies of the executed had been denied burial in consecrated ground, many left in shallow graves near the gallows. Some families returned under cover of night to gather what they could, carrying loved ones home in silence. Grief mixed with fear. Fear that even mourning too loudly might spark fresh suspicion. For the survivors, life did not snap back to normal. The accused who were freed from jail returned to homes that no longer felt safe. Their neighbours looked at them differently, not with open hostility, but with a lingering unease, as if innocence and guilt had blurred too deeply to be untangled. Imagine stepping back into your own kitchen after months in chains, only to find your neighbours whispering as you passed by. That was the reality of Salem's freedom. The colony itself tried to move forward, but guilt hung over it like smoke after a fire. In 1697, a day of fasting and prayer was declared, a public attempt to ask God's forgiveness for the tragedy. On that day, the meeting houses were filled not with the cries of accusation, but with the murmurs of repentance. Men and women who had once demanded executions now bowed their heads in shame. Judge Samuel Sewell, one of the men who had sentenced so many to death, stood before his congregation and confessed his guilt. In a trembling voice, he admitted that he had been wrong, that innocent blood had been spilled because of him. He asked for prayers. not only for the victims but for his own forgiveness. It was one of the first public acknowledgements that Salem had not purged evil, it had committed it. Reverend Samuel Parris, whose household had sparked the trials, faced his own reckoning. His sermons, once fiery condemnations of witches, now rang hollow to a community that had begun to doubt his leadership. Families left his congregation, his position weakened, until finally he resigned and slipped away from Salem, his name forever tied to the tragedy he had helped ignite. The colony also began offering compensation, a strange, almost clumsy attempt to right what could not be undone. In 1711, the government officially restored the good names of some of the victims and paid reparations to their families. But money could not replace lost mothers, fathers, sisters, or sons. For many, the payments felt more like a reminder than a resolution. And yet, despite the apologies and fast days, Salem could never fully scrub the stain from its name. The world remembered. Other towns might have had their witch trials, but none burned as brightly or as destructively as Salem's brief fire. To this day, the name Salem calls up visions of nooses, gallows, and fearful villagers whispering accusations in the snow. The afflicted girls themselves lived on, their futures shaped by the hysteria they had unleashed. Some married, had children, and disappeared into ordinary lives. Others carried the weight of what they had done, even if they never admitted it aloud. How do you live, knowing your screams and visions sent neighbours to the noose? History records their names, but not their late-night thoughts. Salem's regret became part of its story, just as much as the trials themselves. The people who lived through it had to find a way to explain it to themselves and to their children. Some called it a test from God, others a deception of the devil. But for many, the simplest truth was the hardest. They had let fear rule them. They had turned against one another. And when the snow finally melted on Gallows Hill, it left behind not a village purified, but a village haunted. The Salem Witch Trials did not end in 1692, not really. The hangings stopped, the court was dissolved, and apologies were eventually offered, but the story never left. It lived on in whispers, in sermons, in the uneasy way people look back at that fateful year. Salem had gone hunting for witches, but what it had really found was something much more familiar. Fear, power, and the ease with which a community could devour itself. In the years that followed, the trials became a cautionary tale within New England itself. Ministers used it as a warning. See how fear can lead even the faithful astray. Families who had lost loved ones told their children, hoping the story might keep them wary of unchecked authority. And courts, slowly, painfully, began to realise that evidence built only on visions and rumours was a shaky foundation for justice. But Salem's lessons reached beyond New England. Over time, writers, historians and philosophers looked back at the trials and saw in them a universal truth. Mass hysteria is not bound by geography or time. Whether it is witches in the 17th century, political enemies in the 20th, or imagined conspiracies in the 21st, the pattern is the same. Fear makes enemies where there are none, and panic makes executioners out of neighbours. The trials also changed the law. In the aftermath, Massachusetts courts began moving away from spectral evidence. The notion that one person's dream or vision could condemn another slowly lost its grip on the legal system. It was a small but important step towards something modern audiences take for granted, that evidence must be seen, touched, proven. Salem had shown the cost of anything less. For centuries, Salem became a touchstone for writers. Cotton Mather, who had once fanned the flames with his own writings, found his reputation tangled with the trials for the rest of his life. Later, Nathaniel Hawthorne, a descendant of Judge Hathorne, wrestled with the legacy of guilt in his stories. And in the 20th century, Arthur Miller used Salem as the backdrop for The Crucible, a play that drew sharp parallels between the witch trials and the Red Scare. Salem was no longer just about witches, it was about the danger of fear itself. Salem's lessons were not only about law and literature, but about human nature. It showed how quickly suspicion can snowball into hysteria, how grudges can disguise themselves as righteousness, and how authority can fail when it chooses fear over fairness. The names of Rebecca Nurse, Giles Corey and George Burroughs became reminders that even the innocent can hang if the crowd is loud enough. In the centuries since, every generation has found its own witch trials. They may not involve gallows or nooses, but the rhythm is the same: accusations without evidence, fear replacing reason, lives ruined by suspicion. Salem's story became shorthand for injustice. To call something a witch hunt was to say that panic, not truth, was running the show. For Salem itself, the legacy is complex. The town has leaned into its history, turning its grim past into museums, memorials, and even tourist attractions. Each October, visitors arrive by the thousands to walk its streets, learn its history, and in some cases, dress in costumes that turn tragedy into spectacle. Some see it as exploitation, others as a way of keeping the lessons alive. Either way, the story has never stopped being told. But beyond the tourism and the textbooks, Salem endures because its story still feels close. It is not just about 1692, it is about now and tomorrow and every moment when fear tempts us to turn suspicion into truth without stopping to ask whether it deserves to be believed. Salem whispers across 3 centuries that justice is fragile, and that reason must be guarded carefully, or else the rope will be waiting. In the end, Salem's legacy is not only one of shame, but of warning. The people who lived through it could not undo what they had done, but their story became a beacon, a reminder carved into history itself. Every time a society points fingers too quickly, every time rumour outweighs reason, every time fear drowns out fairness, Salem's ghosts stir, and in their silence they ask the same question: what will you do differently? Walk through Salem today, and you won't hear the crack of a judge's gavel or the creak of a rope in the wind. Instead, you'll hear the chatter of tourists, the click of camera shutters, and the sound of footsteps on cobblestone streets polished smooth by centuries. 300 years have passed, yet the year 1692 hangs in the air like fog. The witch trials are long over, but they are not gone. Salem has made them part of its very identity. The heart of Salem's remembrance beats in its memorials. On Charter Street, stone benches bear the names of those who died, etched into granite as if to insist that time cannot erase them. Visitors sit in silence, reading the names slowly. Rebecca Nurse, George Burroughs, Martha Corey. The benches are simple, unadorned, yet powerful. They are not there to entertain, but to remind. In the stillness, the voices of the past feel closer than the laughter of the crowds. Yet Salem is not only solemn. Each October the town transforms. Halloween brings floods of visitors, thousands filling the streets in costumes that range from playful to macabre. The festival, called Haunted Happenings, is part carnival, part history lesson. There are ghost tours, reenactments, and parades where witches ride not broomsticks, but floats draped in neon lights. For some, it feels like an odd celebration of tragedy. For others, it's a way of keeping the story alive in the language people speak today. Spectacle. Museums line the streets, each telling the tale in its own way. The Salem Witch Museum casts the trials as the theatre, its mannequins frozen mid-accusation beneath red spotlights. The Peabody Essex Museum, older and quieter, preserves the documents, the fragile parchments where judges' quills condemned the innocent. Between the drama and the dust, Salem offers its story in both spectacle and scholarship. For the people who live here, Salem's identity is complicated. To outsiders, it is the Witch City, a place of spooky tours and Halloween fun. But to residents, it is also a home where children walk to school past statues of witches and tourists snapping photos. The trials are a burden and a gift, a source of economic energy and of uneasy memory. Salem's modern life balances constantly between history and holiday. Modern Salem also embraces witchcraft in a way 1692 never could. Shops selling crystals, tarot cards and spell books line the streets. Practicing Wiccans and modern witches have made the city a spiritual home. Here, the word witch is not a death sentence. It is a chosen identity, worn proudly on t-shirts, coffee mugs and storefront signs. The irony is sharp. What once killed is now celebrated, even commodified. And yet, beneath the tourism and commerce, the ghosts remain. Walk to Gallows Hill, now a quiet park, and you'll find no carnival lights, no souvenir shops. The grass sways, the trees whisper, and the air carries the weight of memory. There are no gallows now, but knowing what once stood here is enough. Visitors lower their voices, as if the ground itself listens. Salem today is a reminder that history does not sit quietly in books. It seeps into streets, into storefronts, into the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. For every tourist in a witch hat, there is another reading the etched names at the memorial. For every Halloween party, there is a ghost tour ending in silence by an old gravestone. The city holds both truths, the entertainment and the grief, and does not try to separate them. The lessons of Salem echo far beyond Massachusetts. In courtrooms, classrooms, and political debates, witch hunt is still a phrase that carries weight. It is shorthand for injustice, for panic, for the dangers of accusation without proof. Salem has become a symbol bigger than itself. Its streets tell one story, but the world has written many others on top of it. And so Salem endures, both as a place and as a warning. Its houses are painted, its shops are busy, its festivals are loud, but the year 1692 is never far away. Every fall of leaves, every October crowd, every whisper at Gallows Hill brings it back. Salem is not just a town. It is a reminder that fear, once unleashed, can hang the innocent. And it asks us still, when fear comes again, what will we choose to do differently? I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did telling it. The Salem Witch Trials remind us that fear is the oldest magic, and it still works if we let it. Good night, and may history's mistakes stay only in history.